At some point in your journey as a matcha maniac, you've probably asked yourself the question, why on earth do all of the fancy matcha have really long names, and why do they all end in mukashi or shiro? Okay, maybe you haven't asked this, but you should. Like all things tea, the answer is long, confusing, inconsistent, and steeped in a few centuries of history and culture. But altogether, it's quite interesting. Diving into this question opens up the wider topic of matcha names in general. Where do they come from, and what do they mean? Today, matcha is sold under a wide variety of names with seemingly little rhyme or reason to them. So today I'd like to get to the root of tea names and hopefully unmuddy the waters and allow you to shop for matcha with a little bit more confidence. In a blog post I wrote a few years ago, I attempted to make some sense of these names by sorting them into 3 distinct categories. Category number 1 are descriptive names. These usually list the location, cultivar, producer, or other information about the tea. For example, our Uji Asahi lists the origin, Uji, and the cultivar, Asahi. Similarly, our Kyotanabe Gokko lists both the location, Kyotanabe, and the cultivar, Gokko. The next category are generic names. This is what I'm calling things like premium matcha, everyday matcha, superior matcha, culinary matcha, or the dreaded ceremonial grade matcha. As I've spoken about at length, ceremonial grade is a confusing and ultimately meaningless term. The next category is poetic names. These are usually Japanese words or phrases that evoke feelings or imagery that the producer feels complements the tea. These can be single words, such as eiryoku, or longer phrases, often in the form of something no something, such as our uta no mori or seicho no mukashi. Traditionally, you'll find many blends with names like this that end in no shiro or no mukashi. Here I have seicho no mukashi and ungetsu no shiro. Here we see those 2 endings again, shiro and mukashi. Some of these names are unique to certain teas, like these, whereas others are common across multiple brands or producers, such as hatsumukashi or atomukashi. These names have the most interesting backstory. As you'll see, the lines between my nice, clean, distinct categories get very much blurred as we go back through the centuries, and perhaps any attempt at categorizing them is ultimately foolish. Before we dive headfirst into the history, I'm going to need a bowl of tea, and today I'll choose our Betsugi from Arita Sansoyen. This is one of his entry-level usucha. It is pleasant and soft, but with a little bit of bite and balance. I picked this tea on purpose because the name Betsugi is one of the first that appears in the historical record, as you'll see shortly. As the primary target audience of matcha throughout most of its history, especially from around 1500 to 1980, 1985, was practitioners of Cha no Yu, or the Japanese tea ceremony, matcha has been sold under names that are useful and appealing for this crowd. So first, let's see how these names are used in the traditional tea room setting. As I mentioned in my video introducing Cha no Yu, it's customary for the head guest to inquire about the tea after the service of koicha, or thick tea. As this tea is typically of the highest quality, it demands more respect and attention. The 2 questions that are typically asked are ochame wa, what is the name of the tea, and otsume wa, who packed it. The packing in otsume refers to the packing of the chatsubo, something I'll go into a little bit more detail later on. So for this tea here, it's called Betsugi, and it was made by Arita Sansoyen. This isn't a koicha, but I'm answering anyway. In a well-crafted tea gathering, the tea name could potentially be tied into the gathering's theme, which is something that the host stitches together subtly through choices in utensils, food, sweets, and decorations. Usucha, thin tea, regular matcha like this, is traditionally served using slightly lower quality tea than koicha, and is typically not given as much attention. So the guests usually don't ask about it. In theory, but in practice, at least at the tea gatherings that I go to, they ask anyway. An example of a name that fits a theme is ungetsu no shiro, or white of the clouded moon. This would be a great tea for a moon viewing chakai. With this basic understanding in mind, climb into your time machine of choice and follow me back to classical Japan to trace the history of tea names. Wow, we're in classical Japan. As I'll explore in my ever-promised future series about the history of tea in Japan, this beverage took a long time to become popular and widespread. From its introduction to Japan in the 700s all the way to the 1100s, the consumption of tea in Japan was quite limited, predominantly enjoyed by the Buddhist clerics who tended the tea gardens at the temples, and occasionally it was also enjoyed by nobles, courtiers, and aristocrats. As tea was neither bought nor sold, but rather gifted, there was no need to attach a name or a brand to the tea. At best, a tea might be referred to by the temple where it was grown, such as Todaiji or Kofukuji in Kyoto, or maybe Anrakuji in Kyushu. Such provenance-based references would fall under the first of my naming categories, descriptive. Through the 13th to 15th centuries, tea enjoyed a rapid increase in popularity, and with it a shift towards commercialization. One of the most important sources for early Japanese tea history, the Kanazawa documents, are a collection of a few thousand letters and papers written by Hojo Sadaaki, who, judging from his letters, seems to have been an avid consumer of the ever more popular tea, especially tea from Toga-no-o, which he mentions 12 times, at least in the letters that we have. Kozanji and its tea gardens in Toga-no-o, just north of Kyoto, are situated under a dense canopy of beautifully tall trees. This natural shade made this early matcha a little bit sweeter and less bitter, one step towards the artificial shading that we know and love today. References to tea from Toga-no-o dominate the early tea texts, to the point that only tea from Toga-no-o was considered real tea, honcha, or true tea, and it became Japan's first tea brand, as it were. In the 1300s, in the popular party game of Torcha, or Tea Battle, players had to taste multiple different teas and guess where they came from, but the only two options they had to choose from were real tea, honcha, tea from Toga-no-o, or fake tea, tea from literally anywhere else. A text listing the best tea brands from the mid-1300s shed a little bit of light on who else was making good tea. On it were Daigoji and Ninnaji, Uji, Hamuro, and some more. These became lesser brand names throughout the 13 to 1400s, a little lower than Toga-no-o, but still held in high regard. In 1383, Uji was considered equal to Toga-no-o, and by the mid-1400s it had overtaken it as the preferred brand of tea, no doubt thanks to their development of artificial shading sometime in the 1400s. And also, of course, probably to the patronage of the shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Tea seller prices from the 14 to 1500s seem to suggest that while a bowl of local or cheap tea might cost 2 to 6 copper coins, a bowl of Uji tea would cost 500. I'm not sure what the conversion rate is from like medieval Japanese copper coins to yen, but in these centuries, apart from the location of the tea fields, the other information that is recorded in letters and documents is the picking of the tea, with words like shincha, ichibancha, and nibancha. New tea, first picking, and second picking, respectively. One of the earliest tea names in the records appears in 1491, beating Christopher Columbus by 1 year. This name is Mujo, meaning unsurpassed, or literally meaning nothing above this. This name is applied to tea from Uji in an attempt to brand it as the best tea, better than all the other tea, and most importantly, better than tea from Toga-no-o. It is theorized that this name coincides with the development of shaded tea cultivation, which is partially responsible for tea's explosion in popularity during this period. Almost half a century later, we encounter the first record that contains something approaching a tea naming system, with a few new names. In a tea ceremony record from 1548, we have this entry from Tennoji Sotatsu describing the tea that he used for a tea gathering. December 6th. Koicha, Betsugi, Mori. Usucha, Betsugi Sosori, the same. 2 days later, December 8th. Koicha, Mujo. Usucha, Tsumecha. Here we see tea from an Uji producer named Mori, or Mori-en. The Mori were one of the historical tea-growing families in Uji, along with the Hori, but both were later superseded by the Kambayashi family, and this family is still around today. At this point, however, Mori-en's teas were considered the best around. In the diary record, Mori-en's tea is sorted into at least 4 grades, with different grades being used for Usucha and Koicha. From this entry and others from around the same time, we can kind of reconstruct the grading system of this time period, starting from the top, with Betsugi. There's a reason I chose this one. Betsugi translates kind of to separate grade or separate special grade, and this is listed 1 step above Mujo, which was the unsurpassed. Below this we have Betsugi Sosori, below that we have Sosori, which sort of means select grade, and beneath that we have tsumecha, which is packing tea. Many of these names, such as betsugi and sosori, are still around and are treated as poetic names. But as you can clearly see, these names are not poetic at all, but they're just generic quality labels. Not that all different from a modern superior matcha or pinnacle grade matcha. The exception here is the tsumecha, which is less of a name and more of a descriptor. And it is also an insight into how tea was sold and consumed at this time. The named teas, such as betsugi or sosori, would have been sold as tencha, packed into little white paper bags that were tied, sealed, and had the name written on them with a little brush. These bags would then be collected and packed in a chatsubo, or a big ceramic tea jar. The space around these bags was then filled with lower quality tencha, which is used as sort of a padding, a medieval tea-made bubble wrap, which protects the higher quality tea and provides a buffer between the ceramic of the jar and the nice tencha in the paper bags. This packing tea is the tsumecha that's referenced in the diary entries. As the diary entries attest, the lower quality teas were used for usucha and the higher quality teas for koicha. While the chatsubo tradition has mostly faded, it is still practiced today in Cha no Yu. The general practice is to use the bagged teas for koicha and the packing tea, the tsumecha, for usucha. Morien's naming system was relatively stable for a few decades, but as time went on and tea quality and cultivation techniques improved, a new grade was added in the 1580s, gokujo, or supreme. Over time, mujo began to disappear and gokujo reigned supreme. See what I did there? Clearly, Uji was continuing to develop new styles and techniques to improve the quality of their tea. Although I'll admit that these names are really quite silly, like you start with mujo, unsurpassed, then you stack something more impressive above that, special, extra special, supremely special. It's a bit silly. No matter how silly it was, it did seem to work as tea from other regions began copying the Uji brand names, either in imitation or just straight up counterfeit. This became so much of a problem that the ruling warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi passed an edict in January of 1584 prohibiting the sale of tea from other regions under the label of Ujicha or in any packaging that imitated Uji teas. Hideyoshi and Sen no Rikyu particularly favored the Kambayashi family's teas, employing their Gokujo blend for the grand tea ceremony at Kitano, a landmark historical event that deserves its own video. The Kambayashi family continued as the favored tea producer under the following Tokugawa shogunate, who appointed Furata Oribe as its first Ocha Ginmyaku, or tea inspector. He was tasked with sampling, tasting, and purchasing teas for the shogun, as well as overseeing tea production in general. One of the important tasks of the tea inspector was also naming tea blends. While we don't have much information about Oribe's time as the tea inspector, his successor, Kobori Enshu, left quite the legacy. He is thought to be the first person to use the names Hatsumukashi and Atomukashi. It is also said that Enshu preferred matcha that was white, or shiro, in contrast to Oribe, who preferred matcha called aocha, green or blue tea. With that, we finally encountered the words mukashi and shiro. Literally speaking, mukashi means the old times or antiquity, and shiro, of course, means white. So what do they have to do with tea? Unfortunately, no one's quite sure, but there are a few decent theories, so let's dive in. Theory number 1, koicha versus usucha. Many modern companies use these endings to denote distinctions in quality. Take these two teas from Ozawa Safeway, for example. Ungetsu no Shiro is blended for usucha, and Seicho no Mukashi is sold as koicha. And Ozawa-san is pretty consistent with that naming through his lineup, and so are a few other producers. But then here's Arita Sansuyen's Atomukashi and Hatsumukashi, which are both usucha. And he's not alone here. Many producers use the name Hatsumukashi for a low-level or intermediate usucha, such as Ippudo, but then others use it for their top-grade koicha. So clearly this theory has some holes in it. While it's true that many, if not most, modern producers that use this style of name stick by the rule of shiro for usucha and mukashi for koicha, it's a relatively modern convention, and the inconsistency in the handling of the historical names such as Hatsumukashi and Atomukashi belies some deeper meaning. So on to theory number 2. Picking time. One common theory that has been around for quite some time is that the word mukashi isn't used for its meaning at all, but rather for the construction of the kanji character mukashi. It's said that it's a combination of the kanji for 20, or 21 depending on who you ask, and the kanji for day. Smush these two together and you get something that looks like mukashi. This is supposed to be a reference to the 21 days either side of the day of peak harvest. This is traditionally the 88th night of spring, Hachiju Hachiya, roughly around the 2nd of May. Coincidentally, Hachiju Hachiya is a common name for sencha. Following this theory, tea that is picked during the 21 days before the 88th night is called Hatsumukashi, with Hatsu meaning first, and tea that is picked after the 88th is called Atomukashi, with Ato meaning after. This theory explains the mukashis, but what about the shiro? Theory number 3, boiling. As far as we know, for the entirety of Japanese tea's history, up until this point, tea was always steamed after picking to deactivate the enzymes that oxidize it so it stays green. You can learn more about modern tea steaming in these videos. However, as I mentioned, Oribe preferred something called aocha, or green or blue tea, which appears to refer to a now forgotten production method known as the ao seiho, or the blue production method. From the scant historical evidence that survives, it seems that this method was invented in the early 1600s by an Uji tea master named Nagai Teishin and involved boiling the freshly picked tea leaves in a solution of lye. That's lye, L-Y-E, the alkaline substances like soda and potash that are used in traditional soap making. These react with the anthocyanins present in the tea and turn the leaf a kind of deep, dark blue-green. If you don't know what anthocyanins are, these are the compounds that are responsible for the colors of blueberries, black beans, red cabbage, hydrangeas, pansies, ube, and butterfly pea flower. Famously, in many of those cases, they are known to react to pH, the acidity, turning red in acidic solutions and blue in alkaline ones. So by boiling tea in an alkaline solution, like lye, the anthocyanins in these leaves turn blue. So what does this have to do with names? Well, there are a few interpretations here. One is that in contrast to Oribe's new blue tea, the one boiled in lye, Enshu preferred the old-fashioned steaming method, the method of old times, of antiquity, of mukashi. So he named matchas that were steamed something something no mukashi. Interpretation number 2 is that the old steaming method was known as the shiro seiho, the white production method, as opposed to the blue one. So teas that ended in shiro were steamed. Maybe both of these can be true. A third interpretation was that Hatsumukashi meant the first way of making tea, the old way, the steamed way, and that Atomukashi meant the method that came ato, after the old mukashi method. In other words, the blue method. No one is quite sure what the original meaning was, but one thing is very clear. Both Hatsumukashi and Atomukashi were used exclusively for the highest grade of koicha. The Kanbayashi family records say that Hatsumukashi and Atomukashi are the names given to the finest koicha favored by the shogunate, and every tea producer considered them to be the best. While from the 30 onwards, each producer gives their own preferred name to the tea. Some examples of these early preferred names are Ichi no Shiro, I no Taka, Aya no Mori, and Umoji Mukashi. Again, at this point, all the named teas are for koicha, with the filler packing tea used for usucha. While at first only the tea inspector and the producers themselves named the teas, eventually tea ceremony practitioners such as the Sen family as well as tea practicing samurai also began giving them names. This cultural interplay between tea farmers and some of the most powerful people in society gave the farmers and their tea a huge amount of cultural prestige, especially when these names are inspired by poetry and classical literature. Here, finally, we get to real poetic names. There is quite the difference in branding and prestige between Tokujo, supreme matcha, and Ungetsu no Shiro, the white of the cloud-covered moon, a name given to this tea by Zabosai, the 16th generation grandmaster of the Urasenke school of tea. The practice of prominent tea practitioners naming tea is clearly still around and is part of the Konomi system. Konomi, meaning liked or preferred, is basically an endorsement of a tea by a famous tea practitioner, often the Grand Master of a school or the head abbot of a temple. Usually a tea producer will work together with a practitioner to work out a blend that they like, and then the practitioner will give it a name and an endorsement. They get a sustainable supply of their favorite tea, and the producer can now say that their tea is preferred by a famous tea master. So in addition to Ungetsu, one of Zabosai's favored usucha, we have here Seicho no Mukashi, which was a preferred koicha of his father, Hounsai. So there you have the classical and traditional names of tea. Names like Betsugi, Sosori, Mujo, and Tokujo are early medieval quality labels. Hatsumukashi and Atomukashi were reserved for the shogun's favorite koicha, and everything else was either named by the producers or by famous and influential tea consumers. In fact, here is one tea that I've named, Miyama, meaning deep in the mountains. This isn't anything quite so flashy as a koicha, this is a matcha suited for lattes. And on a hot day like today, I could do with a nice latte. The name is both a reference to the mountains of Shiga where it was grown, but also because the way that milk clouds matcha in a latte kind of reminds me of those Suiboku landscape paintings from Song Dynasty China and medieval Japan. The same inspiration for the artwork that I do for the package. I'm going to need a straw. That's quite refreshing actually. For over 5 centuries, since the late 1400s to the late 1990s, almost all matcha has been sold under some sort of name, poetic or otherwise. This only began to change with the trend of single origin tea, sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s probably. Bypassing the blending stage that has been heretofore central to Japanese tea, single origin teas strive to showcase the tea as a direct expression of its unique properties, such as its genetic makeup or cultivar, its soil, climate, and terroir, as well as the farmer's practice and intent. As such, these teas aren't usually given poetic names, but they're just labeled by these properties. So, for example, our Kyotanabe Goko from earlier, which is made from tea plants of the Goko cultivar in the city of Kyotanabe. Pretty straightforward. Both styles of matcha, the traditional blends and the modern single origin, are perfectly valid, and both can be made to the highest of qualities, neither being inherently better than the other. One benefit of the single origin system is that it's more transparent. If you know that Goko is a good cultivar for matcha, and you know that Kyotanabe is a good growing region for tencha, then you might know that this is a good matcha. And it is a good matcha. If you don't know that, then the name might as well be as transparent as Uta no Mori, the Forest of Poems, which is sold as a koicha and is also an exceptional tea. And now that I'm talking about it, I would like a bowl of koicha of Uta no Mori. Oh, that's fantastic. Even on a hot day, nothing beats a bowl of koicha. Now you might be thinking, David, isn't that a bit too much caffeine? And that's where you're right. Uta no Mori is the highest grade of koicha offered by Rishoen, and it's one of my personal favorites of the teas that we sell. It's pretty fantastic, and it has a lovely poetic name, which helps. That's a brief insight into the history of matcha names and a little look at how we here at Tezumi name our teas. Some are poetically named by the producer, some by us, and some are just named what they are. I hope that makes things slightly less confusing next time you're shopping for matcha. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please leave a like. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for further videos, let me know in the comments down below. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe, because I like to talk about tea, teaware, and tea history. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely bowl or glass of tea. Wide shot.